what I hope the students get out of that is not a mastery of this, but of a way to approach things that are interesting to them. We have an expert on sex magic. What we don't have is an expert on sex magic amongst techno-pagans in the 1990s, which could be someone. I'm just imagining what people could be into. But the idea is we introduce objects of study so that the students have models to use when they go out and want to apply these tools to certain phenomenon that haven't been studied in depth. So really, it's a launching pad for students to, much like us, open up or broaden the study of esotericism to include topics that have been historically marginalized or dismissed altogether.
Traditions are called hermetic because they were attributed to a legendary wisdom teacher, Hermes Trismegistus, the thrice greatest Hermes, as he was called, was supposedly had lived in very ancient times. And so you see in these texts this wisdom teacher, Hermes, teaching his pupils how to achieve perfect knowledge, gnosis, inner knowledge, and salvation. So that is what the texts are all about. And these have been transmitted through the centuries, and Hermetism has become very important through Western esotericism because in the Renaissance in the 15th century, these texts got translated again by a humanist in Florence, Marsilio Ficino, and became the origin of a whole tradition that developed through the Renaissance, through early modernity, the so-called Hermetic tradition. And many later esoteric movements and currents actually have seen themselves as coming from the Hermetica, as part of an Hermetic tradition. So this became a big thing. I will be focusing more on the experiential and on the practical side of the Hermetic type of spirituality. So it was not just book learning, people thinking about philosophical questions, but these were actually people who were trying to change themselves and who were going through quite intense spiritual techniques and practices that they did in order to gain knowledge and gain a different state of consciousness. And I think a key element in understanding the Hermetica is seeing that they worked with alterations of consciousness. So they had to develop techniques, practical techniques for affecting the consciousness of the participants in such a way that they would have visions, they would hear voices, they would gain quite intense transcendental experiences of other dimensions of reality. And so they were not just talking about what they said, they were actually experiencing things, and they were practicing these things in a very practical manner by doing rituals and all kinds of techniques for alterations of consciousness. So the focus is on alterations of consciousness as religious techniques, spiritual techniques, and illustrated with a very specific example of how this worked out in the Hermetic literature in the first century. So that is what it's all about.
Alchemy itself is often called the Hermetic philosophy, and I'd say that it's concerned with transformation, transmutation, even sometimes transfiguration is significant, not just in the laboratory for the investigation of the hidden properties of matter, the attempts to perfect that matter, such as the creation of gold from base metals, but also for the developments of chemical medicine, the arcana, the secrets of 16th century Swiss alchemist Paracelsus and his followers, the chemical philosophers, and also creations of the elixir and the philosopher's stone. And in addition to this, we can't ignore later interest in what you call spiritual or psychological alchemy. The best known representatives for that are the writings of the Swiss psychiatrist or psychologist Carl Gustav Jung, and more recently, James Hillman. Our students generally come from a fairly broad spectrum. Some are more interested in it from a history of science perspective, others to do with connections with magic, for example, or Kabbalah, and then, as mentioned, with psychology as well. One of the most famous alchemical texts is the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, which dates at least as far back as the 9th century Arabic version that you can find in the Book of the Secrets of Creation, as well as another work called The Secret of Secrets. They date from the 9th century, but Latin translations of those appeared in the 12th century. It's a very short text, so that, depending on how you split it up, it's about 12 lines long. And there are innumerable references to this text over the centuries in alchemical works, but also sometimes even in necromantic works like the Picatrix. Sometimes it's just brief quotes, other times more extended commentaries, as well as some visual representations of bits of its symbolism. So that's what I'm going to focus on at the winter school. It'll be part lecture, part seminar. It's easy to find the Emerald Tablet online. You can go to Wikipedia and find Isaac Newton's translation of it. And what I'm hoping is that we'll get time to brainstorm what each line means, what the symbolism in there means, and then I'll take you through some interpretations of fairly well-known alchemists through the centuries. And I hope you find it interesting.
So I'm going to be giving a seminar that's called Sexuality, Magic and Modernity. And during that seminar, we're going to be exploring some of the most influential occult magical currents to have emerged in the 20th century. So we're going to be looking at Aleister Crowley, who was a British occultist, very well known, founded a religion called Thelema. And we're also going to be looking at Kenneth Grant, who was also a British occultist, who was Crowley's secretary towards the end of his life and Crowley's disciple. And his ideas on magic, and specifically sexual magic, and the way that he fused Crowley's Thelemic magic with Indian Tantra. And we're also going to be touching a little bit on Wicca, so British pagan witchcraft basically emerging in the mid-20th century. And specifically, we're going to be discussing these from the perspectives of gender and sexuality. So a crucial thing about these movements and these thinkers is that they saw divinity as both in terms of gods and goddesses, as both masculine and feminine, and they welcomed both women and men as magical practitioners. But more than that, they also saw sexuality in different forms as essential to spiritual practice, or to magical practice, and to communion with the divine. So essentially, we're going to be diving into why these thinkers, these groups, emerged at these times, why they saw gender in specific ways, why they saw sexuality in these ways, and why that's important for understanding basically occultism in a modern perspective. And the reason why this is a part of the program, one reason I think is that looking at esotericism from the perspective of sexuality and gender is important, because it's incredibly fertile, productive material for that kind of analysis. Even if we go back to older forms of esotericism, it's so rich with gendered and erotic symbolism, and that goes all the way up until today. And looking at some of these modern esoteric or occult movements and the way that they negotiate these gender roles and these understandings of sexuality doesn't just tell us important things about esotericism, it also tells us something about the ways that gender and sexuality have been understood in modernity itself.